We welcomed President Macron when he visited Lebanon, and we welcomed the French initiative, but not for him to be judge, jury, and executioner and ruler of Lebanon. This is how Hezbollah Secretary General Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah responded to French President Emmanuel Macron's patronizing behavior towards the Lebanese people. Hezbollah's leader said last week that the Lebanese resistance welcomed French efforts to help Lebanon out of crisis, but that in no way meant French President Emmanuel Macron could act like the country's ruler. Macron, president of former colonial power France, who has led foreign aid efforts, rebuked Lebanese political leaders for allegedly failing to swiftly agree a new government. It was the first step in the French plan seeking to rally them to launch reforms that would unblock billions of dollars cash Lebanon desperately needs. However, Macron's colonial face glowed last week when the French president declared that he was ashamed of Lebanese politicians and deemed it a betrayal as his initiative faltered. Macron criticized Lebanon's two main Shia parties, Hezbollah and its ally Amal, who demanded to name some ministers, particularly the finance post, accusing them to be at the heart of the logjam. However, the deadlock was a deliberate stunt by the so-called ex-Prime Minister's Club in Lebanon. Sayyid Nasrallah accused former Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri, along with other former prime ministers, of pulling the strings in an attempt to exploit the French intervention to score political points. He blamed them for seeking to sideline Hezbollah and its allies, which hold a majority in parliament. So in clear, the US puppets in Lebanon are seeking to eliminate the parliamentary blocs and the president's power. The dangerous part in the ex-Prime Minister's Club game is seeking to introduce new norms to the Lebanese system of governance that Sayyid Nasrallah deemed a threat to the country and was not even a subject of discussion. Sayyid Nasrallah reiterated what Hezbollah has always been very blunt about. The only reason for Hezbollah's presence in the government was always to protect the back of the resistance. However, last week, Hezbollah announced a new reason that will for sure disclose new local enemies. Hezbollah leader declared, the second reason behind our participation in the government is fearing for what has remained from Lebanon economically, nationally, and on all other levels. Warning that methods of coercion do not work in Lebanon, regardless of the advocates and sponsors, be them the US, France, or Europe. Welcome to the Mideastream. I'm Marwa Osman. Hezbollah Secretary General Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah responded to French President Emmanuel Macron's disrespect of the Lebanese people, highlighting that he should respect the Lebanese people's dignity when talking to them. Sayyid Nasrallah accused President Macron of practicing intimidation against the heads of Lebanese parties in order to pass a new government that eliminates the parliamentary blocs. Now, to discuss this issue with us from Beirut is Mr. Ali Murad, political commentator. Thank you for being with us, Ali. Now, Hezbollah chief Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah said last week that his party is still keen on the success of the French initiative, but he heavily criticized Emmanuel Macron, the French president, over his latest remarks, saying, and I quote, "We welcome President Macron's role and the French initiative for helping Lebanon, but not for him to become a prosecutor, ruler, or a custodian over us." What was Macron aiming for by trying a new disrespectful approach, and how do you think this will affect the relationship between France and Hezbollah?
Thank you for having me. First, it's well known that France has historic interests in Lebanon. This is not since the mandate era, but before it. We're talking about since the 18th century. But there are facts that has to be taken into consideration nowadays. There is an American role and a Saudi role in Lebanon. I think that the French president, during his last speech about Lebanon, he was trying to be soft with the Americans and the Saudis. He tried to get along with them with their hawkish approach towards Lebanon and precise towards Hezbollah. Mm-hmm. I think that the French president tried to push Hezbollah to force Hezbollah to make some concessions, political concessions that are opposite to the facts that were presented by the 2018 elections. Mm-hmm. Hezbollah is part of a bloc that won the elections in 2018, and I think that the Americans and the Saudis, they are trying to fulfill one target in Lebanon nowadays, to hold Hezbollah responsible and accountable for the financial and the economic crisis taking place in Lebanon. And this is a complete scheme that is taking place in the region by the Americans. That's the so-called the maximum pressure campaign. So I think the French president, though France has some interests inside Lebanon, they know that they have to talk with all of the Lebanese parties, including Hezbollah, but they had to go to get along with the Saudis and the Americans during the last weeks. But what has leaked out of the meeting that took place between the French ambassador in Beirut and the head of the international relations in Hezbollah after the speech of Sayyid Nasrallah makes us convinced that the French, they are trying to keep their initiative on the table. They are willing to talk with Hezbollah to soften their stance, and including finding some solutions towards finding a way to form a government within the next weeks.
Part of the problem of forming the government, Mr. Murad, was that Sayyid Nasrallah stressed that the naming of the ministers for all sects in Lebanon by a single person was dangerous. And he was meaning here the so-called ex-prime ministers of Lebanon club, who sought to distribute portfolios and to name the ministers by themselves alone without getting other political blocs involved. By that, they would eliminate the parliamentary results, the parliamentary election results, and they would also take away the president's power. So this is very dangerous, especially when you disregard the results of the election. What was the point behind such a move by the same elite who actually brought Lebanon to the political impasse and the economical collapse that it's witnessing right now?
Actually, the four ex-prime ministers, Mr. Hariri, Mr. Sanyura, Mr. Mikati, and Mr. Salam, they all ruled in Lebanon since 2005 till the late 2019. 14 years they were in power. They take responsibility in a percentage like 80 to 90% of what has been taking place inside Lebanon, the corruption, the crisis, the financial crisis, and all those factors that led to the situation now. So they are not the correct party to have the one decision now to form governments and to choose who will have the certain cabinets. I think that the Saudis, they are operating through those ex-prime ministers and in precise through Mr. Hariri. Mr. Hariri, it's true that he has been released in late November 2017 after being kidnapped in Riyadh, but he is still a prisoner. Actually, he physically was released, but his decision, his political decision, is still bound by the Saudis.
There's something that's very interesting that was said by Sayyid Nasrallah when he reminded that Hezbollah must be in the government to protect the back of the resistance so that the May 5, 2008 will not be repeated in Lebanon. Now, are these fears that Sayyid Nasrallah is citing related to the current wave of normalization in the Arab world between the Arabs and the Israeli regime, or rather this is strictly an internal Lebanese political fear?
Actually, it's both internally and due to some factors and incidents taking place in the region with the normalization of some Arab states with the Zionist entity. if you go back to 2008 with the Senura government that took the decision of the May 5th to remove the communication network of the resistance, I think that Hezbollah has legitimate fears dealing with those fears that maybe a new government that was to be formed as the ex-prime ministers wanted would take similar steps now, because when you look at the demarcation of the borders, the maritime and the borders with the Zionist entity, such a government formed by those prime ministers, I think
which would for sure be an anti-Hezbollah government.
Exactly, it would be an anti-Hezbollah. Thus, we cannot make sure that the interests of Lebanon would be put first during the negotiations. And also, we cannot trust such a government with the normalization approach.
To explain it further, which means some people would say, well, even though if this government is formed, it would not take the trust in the parliament, but we need to explain that even if it doesn't take trust, it will still do the managerial work in the institutions, which means it can actually work on the demarcation.
Yes.
In less than a minute, I want an answer for you when Sayyid Nasrallah said that we are also the second maybe a reason for us to be in the government because we are afraid of what's coming for Lebanon economically and nationally and regionally as well. He asked, what if the government accepts conditions of the IMF? Do we agree on a government that increases taxes on citizens? These are all fears that were actually put out in the 17th October revolution, but then they were dropped because of US and Saudi interventions. But is this an indication that any future role for Hezbollah in the upcoming government will be decisive on the economic level?
First of all, we have to be clear. Hezbollah has allies. The bloc that Hezbollah lies in the middle has allies, the Free Patriotic Movement and Amal Movement and other Sunni parties that they form the majority in the parliament. So when we say that Hezbollah has to be in the government to share in the economic and the financial decision that to be taken during the negotiations with the IMF and the World Bank, I think that Hezbollah is signaling that he is not the only one to take the decision. Mm-hmm. He is referring to the group decision by consulting with his allies, especially with President Macron and the Free Patriotic Movement and also the Amal Movement. They the next stage where Lebanon is crossing towards, I think is dangerous. Mm-hmm. There is a bloc inside Lebanon that are trying and they are promoting for selling the assets of the country, and this is a dangerous step. So Hezbollah has to be inside the government with his allies to make sure that the national interests are first, mm-hmm. The interests of the poor and the middle
so
class
basically
inside
the interest
Lebanon.
of the people over those of the 1% that are actually the regime in Lebanon. I want to thank you very much, Mr. Ali Murad, political commentator, for joining us to talk about this matter. Please stay tuned more about Iraq in the next segment. Now, a series of rockets were launched at a base hosting US-led coalition forces inside Erbil International Airport in Iraq's semi-autonomous Kurdistan region, however, causing no damage or casualties. Now, the attack in Erbil, a rare target for rockets, is considered a serious escalation by Iraqi officials, and it came just hours after Iraqi Prime Minister had pledged to improve protection of foreign missions in his country. Now, the US base under attack in Erbil in this following report. Rockets struck an Iraqi base used by US and coalition forces near the airport in the Kurdistan capital of Erbil late Wednesday, September 30. Hours after Iraqi Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi told foreign diplomats that the country would put a stop to such attacks. Amateur video showed a string of fires burning in an empty field not far from a US-led coalition base near Erbil airport in Iraqi Kurdistan. Hours later, without any investigation, Kurdish security officials accused Iraq's PMU, known better as Hashd al-Shabi, of firing the rockets used in the overnight attack. However, Hashd al-Shabi forces denied responsibility. The Nineveh Operations Command, affiliated with the Popular Mobilization Forces, officially denied on October 1st any involvement in the rocket attack that targeted Erbil International Airport. The Nineveh Operations Command said in a statement, "We express our regret and surprise over some of the hasty reactions regarding the rocket attack that targeted the city of Erbil. The area from which the rockets were launched towards Erbil is considered an uninhabited area located in a triangle surrounded by the army, the Popular Mobilization Forces, and the Peshmerga." The statement added that an investigation has been opened into the accident and surveillance cameras will be monitored to find out from where the missile-loaded vehicle came from. In September, the United States had already threatened to close its embassy in Baghdad if the Iraqi government did not move to stop attacks on American occupation compounds. Anti-US sentiment has been running high in Iraq following Washington's January 3 assassination of top Iranian anti-terror commander Lieutenant General Qasem Soleimani and senior Hashd al-Shabi commander Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, in addition to several other comrades outside the Baghdad airport. Just 2 days later, Iraqi lawmakers unanimously passed a bill mandating the expulsion of all foreign troops from the country. Iraqi resistance groups have vowed to avenge the assassinations, but denied any role in the growing rocket attacks on foreign missions. Now, to discuss this issue with us from Sweden is Mr. Firas Ali, political commentator. Thank you for being with us, Firas. Now, just hours after Iraq's government pledged to protect overseas missions in the country, a series of rockets were launched at a US base in Iraqi Kurdistan. Now, the rockets were intercepted. They caused no damage. What do you think was the main message behind such an escalation?
Thank you, Marwa. Well, actually, this issue could have several goals. One of them is to portray Iraq as a weak country with minimal government control. A second goal could be to defame the picture of PMU in the eyes of the Iraqi people. And a third goal could be, as you mentioned in the report, that this happened in Iraqi Kurdistan, to create a strife between Baghdad, Erbil, between PMU and the Kurdish forces. The odd thing with this event, as I see it, is that it actually happened in Iraqi Kurdistan, which is known to be a safe area in Iraq. And the Kurdish forces and intelligence forces have good control over the area. Therefore, we have also seen in reports from the media that there is a form of Israeli presence in the area. And as you know, with Israeli presence, Israeli intelligence forces also come. So this area is not an area where PMU have heavily influence or any freedom to move freely as they wish. They are most probably been monitored by local and foreign intelligence.
Well, Firas, the US-led coalition currently maintains a troop presence on a base inside Erbil airport, while the country's diplomatic compound is located in the heavily fortified Green Zone in Baghdad, the capital, which has been site for multiple rocket attacks this past year. While Trump he's not about to be able to do anything, especially right now in October before the elections. But how do you think the reaction will be from the White House, given all of this escalation in one area of Iraq?
Well, I don't think the size of these attacks could be used as a pretext for a wider escalation against PMU, especially not now so close to the elections. Mm-hmm. As all know, the US have internal problems. 3 of them are very big. The first one is the badly mismanaged corona pandemic. And the second one is the Black Lives Matter movement and the rights of the Black Americans. Mm-hmm. And the third is the issue of the white supremacists that we see more and more on US streets, heavily armed. And also, we're not to forget that Trump, who recently was diagnosed with corona, probably would use his time back in office in the White House for the election campaign. And you can see, Marwa, that the silence from the US administration regarding the war in Armenia and Azerbaijan between them, this could be a finger pointing of how unfocused the US administration is for the moment being on foreign issues. The focus is already nearly 100% on the election that is coming soon.
Well, Kurdish officials, namely the former finance minister Hoshyar Zebari, said that the rocket incident in Erbil was yet another escalation to undermine security in the country by, and I quote, the same groups who are attacking the US embassy in Baghdad and its convoys, and action is needed to stop it. Does this mean that there will be pressure against the Iraqi army to push them towards a possible confrontation with the popular mobilization forces in Iraq in general and in Baghdad in specific, while knowing, by the way, that the Hashd al-Sha'bi denied any responsibility with that attack in Erbil?
Yes, I think that this is a part of the mounting political pressure on the Iraqi government. And as you mentioned, the threats to close the embassy is one of them. This is another one. And it's interesting that Zebari himself, known to be a well-known politician in Iraq, not known to disclose information from discussions behind closed door, it takes to Twitter to announce such things now. So the question for the Iraqi people is, what does Zebari know that the other politician doesn't know? And why Zebari? Because he doesn't have a big role for the moment being. So it's very unusual for an Iraqi politician to make such statements. Besides, until now, I've not seen any proof of PMO fingerprints behind the rocket attacks. I personally regularly follow the Iraqi security media cell updates about this issue, and they have not pointed the fingers at the PMO for the moment for these attacks. And the allegations for the moment being is only from the US forces and from Zebari. And we all know that is unproven for the moment. So we have to wait and see what proof they put forward, if they do that.
According to Iraqi authorities, the area from which the rockets were launched is shared area between the Popular Mobilization Forces, the Iraqi army, and the Kurdish Peshmerga forces, who are very close to that point of launching the rockets. What if this was just a false flag attack to start a full American operation against the Popular Mobilization units? If not an American-led one, a coalition-led one. We do have lots of countries in Iraq, as we know. And how do you think Iraq will handle such a clash if it happens?
Well, any U.S. military action or international coalition, we all know that the U.S. forces are the leaders in the coalition. If that will happen against the PMO, it will backlash heavily, and it will certainly hasten the full pull-out for the U.S. forces from Iraq.
But we know the U.S. usually uses mercenaries, and they might actually use the Peshmerga against the PMU, so internal factions fighting.
Exactly. And I don't think the Iraqi government or the institutions are interested in driving the matter to that far, because it would cause problems for them locally in Iraq. As you mentioned in your report, the patience with the U.S. forces in Iraq is very low, especially after the 3rd January and the assassinations of the two top leaders, who are very popular in Iraq because of their successful war against Daesh in Iraq. So anything like that would be a suicide for Trump. And in this case, I don't think that all options are on the table. The situation in Iraq is very different from before, and the U.S. forces who regularly violate Iraqi sovereignty are not popular. This would actually also constitute an attack on Iraqi security forces, as the PMU since 2016 are part of the official security forces. And the Iraqi government can't be silent about this. And in the matter of fact, I think that if this happened, it will also nullify the ongoing negotiations between Baghdad and Washington about the presence of U.S. forces in Iraq.
So that might actually increase the pressure against the U.S. Presence, the illegal presence of the coalitions, you're saying?
Exactly.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Firas Ali, political commentator, for joining us from Stockholm. Thank you very much for your contribution. I want to thank you for watching, and please stay tuned next week for more from the Mideastream.